Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Specifically, some concepts that, you guys have sent to us and that seem to really resonate with a lot of you. And that is this idea of life centers.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating how Covey kind of lays this out and points out that a lot of us, we tend to jump between different centers like our spouse
Right.
or our family or, our work or money, even things like possessions or pleasure.
It's almost like we're on this constant roller coaster, right? One
Yeah.
day our focus is here and the next day it's over there. And Covey argues that this lack of a stable center, I mean, that's a huge drain on our effectiveness.
Absolutely. And you would think, kind of just on the surface, that the solution is pretty simple, right? You just pick one center and you stick to it.
Right.
But from what I'm reading here, Covey's saying it's not that straightforward.
Yeah, you're catching on quickly.
Yeah.
Covey suggests that, simply choosing any one of those things, it can still lead to a pretty reactive life.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
think about it. If you're totally spouse-centered, I mean, any little bump in the relationship,
Yeah.
I mean, it could throw you completely off course.
Okay, I see what you mean. So if focusing solely on our spouse or our work or even our family isn't the answer, what does Covey suggest is a more effective alternative?
Well, he advocates for what he calls a principle-centered life.
Okay.
So instead of reacting to all these external circumstances, you're grounded in a set of timeless principles
Okay.
that guide your decisions and actions. And Covey believes that these principles provide the true foundation for security and guidance and wisdom and ultimately power.
Mm-hmm.
The 4 core ingredients, he says, for a truly effective life.
That's a really interesting idea, basing your life on principles instead of just constantly reacting to whatever's happening around you. But what kind of principles are we talking about here? Is it like having a strict set of rules to live by, or?
Not exactly. It's
Yeah.
more about, identifying your core values, those fundamental truths that resonate deep within you.
Mm.
These principles could be things like honesty or integrity or fairness,
Yeah.
service to others, continuous learning. Um,
Yeah.
the specific principles will vary, I think, from person to person.
So how do these principles actually play out in everyday life? Can you give me an example of how someone might approach a decision differently based on, this principle-centered approach?
Absolutely. Let's say you've been asked to work late on a project,
Okay.
but you also promised your family you'd attend your child's school play that same evening.
Mm-hmm.
A work-centered person might automatically prioritize the project,
Right.
potentially causing tension at home.
Right. And someone who's family-centered might feel obligated to skip work, even if it means jeopardizing the project.
Right.
So how would a principle-centered person navigate this situation?
Well, they might pause and consider which principle is most relevant in this situation.
Okay.
Is it integrity,
Yeah.
keeping a promise to their family? Or is it a commitment to excellence in their work?
Right.
By reflecting on their guiding principles, they can then make a conscious decision
Yeah.
that aligns with their core values
Mm-hmm.
and then communicate their choice clearly and respectfully.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about rigidly following rules, but rather using your principles as a compass to guide your choices, in a way that feels authentic and aligned.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, how does someone actually go about identifying these core principles and building this principle-centered life?
That's where Covey introduces this powerful tool,
Okay.
personal mission statement.
Okay.
He describes it as your personal constitution,
Mm-hmm.
a document that outlines your core values
Yeah.
and provides a framework for making decisions that are in harmony with your deepest beliefs.
So it's like creating a roadmap for your life based on what truly matters to you.
That's a great way to put it.
That sounds like a great exercise, but I imagine it can be pretty challenging to distill all of that down into a single statement.
It definitely takes some introspection.
Yeah.
Covey suggests breaking it down into roles and goals.
Okay.
Think about the different roles you play in your life,
Mm-hmm.
individual, parent, spouse, employee, community member,
Yeah.
and then define what success looks like in each of those areas.
Okay, so it's about aligning your actions and your goals with your values in every aspect of your life.
That's the idea.
That makes a lot of sense. But does Covey offer any specific examples of what a mission statement might look like?
He does. He actually shares a compelling story about a hotel with exceptional customer service.
Okay.
What set this hotel apart wasn't just their luxurious amenities,
Right.
but the fact that every employee, from the housekeepers to the managers,
Yeah.
was involved in crafting the hotel's mission statement.
So it wasn't just a top-down decree from corporate You know, everyone had a voice in shaping the values that would guide their actions and interactions.
Exactly, and that shared ownership
Yeah.
led to a truly unified culture where everyone was pulling in the same direction.
That's amazing.
Covey stresses that involvement is crucial when crafting mission statements,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's for an individual, a family, or an entire organization.
Yeah.
He even has this great quote, "No involvement, no commitment."
That really resonates with me, and it makes me think about those times when I've felt most engaged and motivated, and it's usually when I've had a hand in shaping the goals and,
Right?
and the direction of a project.
Exactly.
But I have to admit, even though I love the idea of a personal mission statement, I'm still feeling a bit stuck on how to actually create one.
Sure.
Do you have any advice for someone who's feeling overwhelmed by that process?
Well, it's understandable to feel a bit overwhelmed,
Yeah.
you know. Crafting a personal mission statement, it's a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
And it's not about creating this perfect document.
Yeah.
It's more about engaging in a process of self-discovery.
Mm-hmm.
What I find helpful is starting with a simple question, you know, what kind of impact do you want to have on the world?
Wow, that's a powerful question. I think, a lot of us, we get so caught up in the day-to-day that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Precisely. Covey would say that, without a clear sense of purpose, we become susceptible to all these external forces,
Mm-hmm.
that are pulling us in different directions.
Right.
But when we have that strong internal compass, we're less likely to be swayed by those pressures.
It's like we're building an anchor that keeps us grounded,
Yeah.
amidst the chaos of life. I'm starting to see how that principle-centered approach can lead to a greater sense of peace and stability.
Right.
But how do our interactions with other people fit into all of this? I'm looking at some of these materials you send over, and it seems like Covey talks a lot about relationships.
He does.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
for good reason, Covey argues that our relationships are the ultimate testing ground for our principles.
Okay.
It's easy to espouse these lofty ideals,
Right.
but it's in our interactions with others that we truly reveal our character.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about Covey's perspective on relationships.
One of his most insightful concepts is the emotional bank account.
It's okay.
He uses this brilliant metaphor to describe the dynamics of trust in any relationship.
Hmm.
Imagine a bank account where you make deposits and withdrawals right.
Okay.
Deposits are those actions that build trust and strengthen the connection.
So what kind of actions count as deposits in this emotional bank account?
We'll think about those small acts of kindness, understanding, consideration, that make you feel valued and appreciated in a relationship.
Yeah.
Things like keeping promises, listening attentively,
Mm-hmm.
offering sincere compliments, even apologizing when you've made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
These all contribute to a positive balance in the emotional bank account.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we're making investments in the health and well-being of the relationship.
Precisely.
But what about withdrawals? I'm guessing those are the actions that damage trust and erode the connection.
You're right on the mark. Withdrawals are those things that leave us feeling hurt or disrespected or disregarded.
Right.
It could be breaking a promise, being inconsiderate of someone's feelings, or failing to follow through on a commitment.
Mm-hmm.
These actions, they chip away at the trust that's been built up over time.
This analogy is really resonating with me. It makes those abstract concepts of trust and connection, so much more tangible.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, in the materials you sent over, you specifically highlighted Covey's emphasis on seeking win-win solutions.
Right.
How does that concept tie into this idea of the emotional bank account?
That's a great question. Covey actually argues that building those reserves of trust, in the emotional bank account,
Yeah.
that's essential for creating win-win solutions.
Okay.
When we have strong foundation of trust, we're more likely to approach conflicts and disagreements with a collaborative spirit,
Mm-hmm.
seeking solutions that benefit everyone involved.
So it's not just about being nice or avoiding conflict. It's about creating an environment where we can honestly communicate our needs.
Right.
And work together to find solutions that satisfy everyone. That sounds ideal, but I have to admit it can be hard to maintain that win-win mindset, especially when we're dealing with people who seem determined to get their way no matter what.
You've hit on one of the biggest challenges of the win-win paradigm.
Yeah.
It's so tempting to fall into those familiar patterns of win-lose thinking,
Right.
Either we get our way or someone else does.
Right.
But Covey argues that this approach is ultimately short-sighted and damaging to relationships.
I see what you mean. If we're constantly competing or trying to one-up each other, it creates a climate of distrust and resentment.
Right.
But how do we actually shift from that win-lose mentality to a more collaborative win-win approach?
Covey outlines a really helpful framework for understanding different approaches to conflict, which he calls the 6 paradigms of human interaction.
Okay, I'm all ears. Break down these 6 paradigms for me.
All right, so the first one is win-win, which we've been discussing. It's that sweet spot,
Right.
where everyone feels heard and respected and ultimately benefits from the solution.
And I imagine the opposite of win-win would be win-lose, where
Exactly.
it's all about coming out on top, even if it means someone else loses out.
Precisely. And then there's lose-win, which is essentially giving in or surrendering to
Yeah.
avoid conflict.
Okay, so those 3 paradigms are pretty straightforward. What about the other 3?
Well, then you have lose-lose, which is a pretty grim scenario
Yeah.
where everyone ends up worse off.
Ouch, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It definitely is. And then there's win, where the focus is solely on getting what you want,
Okay.
regardless of the impact on others.
So it's kind of like operating in a vacuum, you know?
Yeah,
You're only concerned with your own needs and desires, even if it means stepping on others to get what you want.
exactly. And finally, Covey introduces a really interesting 6th paradigm, win-win or no deal.
Intriguing. What does that one entail?
It basically means that if you can't find a solution that genuinely benefits both parties,
Yeah.
you agree to walk away.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the best course of action is to simply not engage.
Okay, so it's about setting healthy boundaries and recognizing that forcing a solution when there isn't a true win-win outcome can be more damaging in the long run.
Right.
But I'm curious, out of all these paradigms, why is Covey such a strong advocate for win-win?
Well, he believes it's the most sustainable and fulfilling approach to human interaction, especially in those relationships that truly matter,
Mm-hmm.
like with our spouses and our families and our close colleagues.
Right.
He emphasizes that it's not just about one-time transactions.
Yeah.
It's about building those long-term emotional bank accounts that we talked about.
I see the connection now. By consistently striving for win-win solutions, we're making those deposits of trust and goodwill that
Yeah.
strengthen the foundation of the relationship. It makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But I have to be honest, I'm a bit intimidated by the idea of always seeking win-win.
Sure.
It sounds like a pretty high bar to set,
Yeah.
especially in the heat of the moment when emotions are running high.
You're not alone in feeling that way.
Hmm.
It's important to remember that win-win is a journey, not a destination. And it starts with a shift in mindset,
Okay.
moving away from that scarcity mentality, that belief that there's only so much to go around,
Mm-hmm.
and embracing a more abundant perspective.
Okay, that makes sense if we're coming from a place of fear and lack.
Right.
It's hard to genuinely believe that everyone can win.
Exactly.
But if we can tap into that sense of abundance, it opens up the possibility for more creative and collaborative solutions.
Precisely.
Do you have any advice for someone who's struggling to shift from that scarcity mentality to a more abundant mindset?
One powerful practice is to start noticing those scarcity-based thoughts as they arise.
Okay.
You know, when you catch yourself thinking, there's not enough for everyone, or if they win, I lose,
Yeah.
try to consciously reframe that thought. Remind yourself that abundance is all around us.
I love that idea. It's about becoming aware of those limiting beliefs and then choosing to replace them with more expansive and empowering thought. But I'm curious, once we've started to cultivate that abundant mindset, what are some practical steps we can take to actually implement win-win thinking in our day-to-day interactions?
One of the most fundamental principles is to truly seek to understand the other person's perspective
Okay.
before trying to make your own point.
Mhm.
Covey calls this empathic listening.
Oh, I've heard that term before, but I have to admit I'm not always the best listener, especially when I'm feeling stressed or rushed.
We all struggle with that. But empathic listening is about more than just hearing the words.
Right.
It's about putting yourself in the other person's shoes, trying to see the world through their eyes,
Yeah.
understanding their feelings and their needs.
Okay, so it's about going beyond the surface level and really tuning into what's going on beneath the words,
Right.
the emotions, the motivations, the underlying values. It sounds like a completely different way of listening.
It is, and it requires conscious effort.
Yeah.
You know, it's about resisting that urge to interrupt or to judge
Yeah.
or to offer solutions before you've fully grasped their perspective.
So it's about being fully present, curious, and genuinely interested in understanding where they're coming from,
Yeah.
even if you don't agree with them.
You got it. And once you've truly listened and understood, then you can start to express your own needs and desires.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about suppressing your own point of view,
No,
but rather creating a space where both perspectives can be heard and respected.
exactly.
I'm starting to see how this approach can lead to more authentic and meaningful communication.
Hmm.
But what about those situations where you've listened carefully, you understand their perspective, but you still fundamentally disagree? How do you find that win-win solution when there seems to be a genuine conflict of interests?
That's where the real magic of win-win thinking comes in. It's
Mm.
about moving beyond the initial positions
Okay.
and digging deeper to uncover the underlying needs and interests that are driving those positions.
Okay, so instead of getting stuck in a battle of wills,
Right.
we're trying to get to the heart of the matter, what's truly motivating each person's stance.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Because often when we take the time to understand those deeper needs,
Yeah.
we discover that there's more common ground than we initially realized.
This is reminding me of those times when I've been able to resolve a conflict with someone by simply asking, help me understand why this is so important to you.
Yes.
Sometimes that simple question can completely shift the dynamic from adversarial to collaborative.
That's a perfect example. It's about moving from a place of judgment and defensiveness to a place of curiosity and empathy.
I'm starting to see how this approach could really transform the way we approach conflict, both in our personal and professional lives.
Absolutely.
But I have to admit, even though I'm embracing this whole win-win philosophy, I'm still feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the information.
Sure.
Is there a way to simplify it, to boil it down to its essence?
Yeah, I love how you put that. It's about moving from scarcity to abundance, from competition to collaboration that feels so much more manageable, than trying to master this complex set of techniques. It really is about a fundamental shift in mindset. And remember, like any significant change, it takes practice. You won't nail it every time, and that's okay.
Speaking of practice, something you mentioned earlier really struck me. Covey's idea that every problem is a PC opportunity.
Oh, yeah.
Could you elaborate on what he means by that?
Well, he's referring back to that emotional bank account we discussed.
Okay.
Every problem, even those frustrating or messy ones, they present a chance to make a deposit in a relationship.
Wait, so even those conflicts that leave me feeling drained and discouraged
Yeah.
can be a good thing. That's a tough one to swallow.
It seems counterintuitive,
Yeah.
right? But think about it. Those challenging moments, they force us to communicate more clearly,
Mm-hmm.
to practice empathy, to work together, to find solutions.
Mm-hmm.
They offer a chance to strengthen the bonds of a relationship.
So instead of seeing those conflicts as setbacks, I could reframe them as opportunities for growth.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful shift in perspective.
And I know from your notes that you're interested in applying these principles to your workplace.
Right.
So think about a recent conflict you've had with a colleague. How might that experience have played out differently if you'd approached it as a PC opportunity?
That's a good question, if I'm honest. My default mode is to either avoid conflict altogether or just try to smooth things over as quickly as possible. But I'm realizing that that might not always be the most effective approach, especially if I want to build, stronger, more authentic relationships.
It's a common pattern, and one that Covey addresses directly. He argues that we often shy away from those difficult conversations because we're afraid of damaging the relationship. But ironically, it's often those very conversations that have the potential to deepen the connection.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like those conflicts are actually opportunities to build trust and understanding if we can approach them with the right mindset.
Exactly. And remember, it all starts with that foundation of character.
Mm.
That commitment to integrity, to seeking win-win solutions, to making deposits in those emotional bank accounts.
This has been such an illuminating deep dive. Covey's ideas about life centers, principle centered, living the emotional bank account, win-win, thinking they've given me so much to reflect on and apply in my own life.
Well, it's been a pleasure exploring these concepts with you. Remember, true effectiveness isn't just about achieving goals. It's about aligning your actions with your deepest values and building strong, fulfilling relationships along the way.
And as you go back to those excerpts from Seven Habits, here's a final thought to ponder. Covey suggests that by consciously seeking PC opportunities, we can transform even the most challenging situations into moments of growth and connection. How might you apply this principle in your own life starting today?
What a powerful question to leave our listener with. I encourage you to dive back into Covey's work and see how these principles resonate with you. You might be surprised at the positive ripple effects that unfold when you start living these habits.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We look forward to exploring more fascinating ideas with you in the future.